and forever. Amen. The Lord bless us and preserve us from all evil and keep us in eternal life. Amen. Let us bless the Lord.
We come now to item 9. For this item, members will need GS 2158 and the 6th notice paper and 12th notice paper, which contain financial statements relevant to the main motion and the amendment. This is a debate on the Archbishop's Council's response to the recommendations contained in the May 2019 investigation report of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. Members will realise that the motion has a very clear focus, and of course speeches should be addressed to that clear focus. However, there is an amendment in the name of the Bishop of Huddersfield at item 48, and I propose to take that early in the course of our business this morning to allow the slightly wider debate that will be possible. Members, I know, will be very aware that there are survivors of abuse in this chamber, in the gallery, and indeed following our proceedings from beyond these walls. And I know that we will all wish to be mindful of that when speaking with care and sensitivity. Could I now invite the Synod to spend a moment of silence as we prepare for this debate? Loving God, give us ears to hear, eyes to see, hearts of compassion, and the will to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with you, our God. Amen. So I now invite the Bishop of Bath and Wells to speak to the motion at item 9. Bishop, you have up to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Synod. When I took on the role of lead safeguarding bishop some 4 years ago, it would be fair to say that I didn't really know all that I was getting into. As I've often said, I am not a safeguarding professional. And as I get ready to pass the lead safeguarding responsibility to Jonathan Gibbs, Bishop of Huddersfield, I reflect on these years, an experience and a privilege I will never forget. The ICSA hearings, the conversations with victims and survivors, the learning lessons reviews, all this together has had a deep and profound impact upon me. At times I've been left angry and bitterly ashamed at how the church I love has behaved, but I've also seen light being shone into dark places. The past 4 years has been an important period for the Church in its safeguarding work. Significant progress has been made. The Church has improved governance, invested significantly in posts, training, and audits. It's developed a suite of guidance, procedure, and policy, and has, in doing so, taken necessary steps towards a safer system that seeks to prevent abuse. We can and should celebrate some of our safeguarding achievements. Circa 250,000 people have now completed safeguarding training. We have an independent national safeguarding panel acting as our critical friend and supporting national safeguarding governance. Safeguarding is now firmly embedded into our recruitment processes for clergy and church offices. Yet these developments, whilst incredibly welcome, have come about too slowly, and we know that, and we have much further to travel on our safeguarding journey. As lead bishop for safeguarding, I've seen firsthand that there remains a very real danger that when safeguarding is discussed in the church, that we still experience it as something other or as somebody else's responsibility. I said at the start that I'm not a safeguarding professional, but as a bishop, I know that safeguarding must be at the very heart of all of our work in the church, embedded in our theology, in our mission, in our practice, and in our policies. We must remember that safeguarding affects us all, every member of this synod, and every member of the church have safeguarding responsibilities. It is not a responsibility we can pass to anybody else. I shall be pleased to welcome the amendment which is being brought by the Bishop of Huddersfield, and I'm grateful to him for this. The amendment calls for a more survivor-centred approach and a commitment to exploring options for redress. I endorse the spirit of this amendment, and I hope that Synod will accept it. We must all work together to make the church a safer place for everyone, and one that responds with care, compassion, and professionalism to victims and survivors. So as we come to this debate, I ask you to remember, as our chair has already done, that victims and survivors of abuse are amongst us today. I hope that in our debate, we'll hear a very wide range of voices and consider the calls for change that I hope will come, whilst respecting the very real sensitivities that are involved. To begin, I'd like to give you a brief background into the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, or ICSA. The inquiry was established in March 2015 by the government to consider the growing evidence of institutional failures to protect children from child sexual abuse and to make recommendations to ensure the best possible protection for children in the future. Some estimates suggest that one child in every 20 in the United Kingdom has been sexually abused. The inquiry also incorporates the Truth Project, which offers victims and survivors of abuse the opportunity to share their experiences in writing, on the telephone, or in person. And to date, over 4,000 people have come forward to speak to and with the Truth Project. In May 2019, the Truth Project published a thematic report into child sexual abuse in religious institutions. It provides powerful qualitative and quantitative evidence that sexual abuse in a religious setting is a terrible abuse and breach of trust, a breach of faith, and an abuse of power. In their findings, they note that individual perpetrators were afforded trust and high standing where their actions were never questioned and their ability to abuse were never contemplated. The investigations into the sexual abuse of children in the Church of England came following an invitation from the Archbishop of Canterbury. And to date, there have been 3 public hearings. In March 2018, there was a 3-week hearing into the Diocese of Chichester, which considered the multiple allegations of sexual abuse which had occurred there and the resulting investigations. In July 2018, there was a 1-week inquiry into the case study of Peter Ball, the former Bishop of Lewes and subsequent Bishop of Gloucester. In July 2019, there was a further 2-week hearing on safeguarding in the church more widely. This considered whether themes identified in the first hearings were national issues, and 4 dioceses were chosen as sample dioceses for a deep dive analysis. Throughout these hearings, the powerful testimonies of victims and survivors of sexual abuse in the church have provided the strongest evidence that our safeguarding journey is far from done. Listening to their accounts has been deeply moving and often harrowing, and I commend their bravery and I thank them for coming forward. These are voices that we need to hear and to heed. The inquiry has also heard from staff throughout the church, from parish safeguarding officers to the Archbishops of Canterbury and York. And in all our engagement with ICSA, we've sought to be open and transparent, welcoming the opportunity to explore our safeguarding practice and seeking ways to move it forward. In May 2019, the inquiry published its interim report into the Anglican Church, focusing on the first two case study hearings, Chichester and Peter Ball. We anticipate that the inquiry will publish a further report on safeguarding in the church later this year, and we recognise and acknowledge there will be more recommendations and further matters to consider. The National Safeguarding Team have put strenuous efforts into identifying the key themes which have emerged from the ICSA hearings, including our response to victims and survivors, issues with the clergy discipline measure, and oversight and governance of safeguarding. Synod will be pleased to hear that we are already working to address these and other issues and to build them into our safeguarding practice. Today, though, this Synod is asked to consider the first report that we've received from the inquiry, which gave 5 key early recommendations. These are outlined in GS 2158. I would emphasise that all 5 of these recommendations have been welcomed and accepted by the Church in their entirety. I hope that Synod will see from the paper that we've already taken significant steps in our efforts to implement these 5 recommendations. I look forward to hearing this debate, and I encourage Synod to give unequivocal support to the motion, and I hope the amended motion that has come before us this morning. Thank you, Chair.
Before we begin our debate, may I just mention that members of the National Safeguarding Team are available during the course of this debate and immediately afterwards if anybody wishes to speak to them. Item 9 is now open for debate. I call the Archbishop of Canterbury. The time limit is 5 minutes, Your Grace.
Thank you, Chair Justin Welby, Canterbury 1. I want to start by reaffirming what Peter said and agreeing with every word he said, including that I hope very much that we affirm as close to unanimously as possible the motion as amended and with its amendments. I want to reaffirm my apology and to join in with his to the survivors and victims who are here today, and to echo his words, to quote his words, they are voices we need to hear and to heed. I want to reaffirm that I know that around this chamber, in the House of Bishops, in the House of Laity, in the House of Clergy, there are victims and survivors at different stages, more than we think, as well as those in the gallery who have had the courage and the resilience to come forward and to demonstrate how badly we've done in the past and what we need to do. We are deeply committed to listening to and implementing the recommendations of ICSA and to pursuing more urgently the desire for a safe church. And as Peter said, the journey is far from done. In this debate, let us hold to the fact that we have not gone nearly as far as we should. We have not satisfied the conditions to be a safe church, and there is much more to be done. Peter mentioned, and I echo, CDM, responses to victims and survivors, and the independence of safeguarding as areas that we need to continue to deal with. Having said that there is nothing that we can be complacent about, far from it, quite the reverse, I want to pay tribute to Peter for the work that he has done. It has been onerous, utterly consuming, personally costly. It has, as it did with Paul before him, it has been at high personal cost, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, even physically. I quote from something that was sent completely unsolicited from a survivor of clergy sexual abuse. The survivor says, "Below is what I'd like the Archbishop to read as a thank you to Bishop Peter. Please pass this on to him," which I'm now doing. It's to be anonymous. I quote, "Thank you on behalf of a survivor of clergy sexual abuse for all you have done within the Church. For myself, you've been a true shepherd, making yourself available and giving of your time, looking out for me and exposing yourself to harrowing situations to bring me and others healing, counteracting past abuse by clergy. Thank you for creating a safe place of care and for bringing light into darkness. God bless you." I want us to reflect on that. Not because we can say, "Oh, haven't we done well?" No, we haven't, not nearly well enough. Far from it. And I say that to victims and survivors, far from it. Our new Episcopal lead on safeguarding has a huge mountain to climb, and we must climb it with him. We must climb it most of all with them. But I say it because I hope this synod will rise to its feet and acknowledge the enormous sacrifice that is made by those who take the lead on this. And with those words, I end. Peter, thank you.
We continue with the debate at item 9. Kashmir Garson, followed by the Bishop of Burnley.
Senior manager within the National Probation Service and have a vested interest in the legal definition of positions of trust, will place such changes on a statutory footing and as such provide the Church with powers to enforce such changes where necessary. I particularly welcome the approach of learning lessons case reviews for sharing learning. This will mirror the learning from serious case reviews within children's services, the serious further offence reviews within the probation service, the prison and probation ombudsman reviews into deaths, and learning from domestic homicide reviews. By undertaking these reviews independently of the home parish or diocese, the Church can learn from actual events to strengthen their procedures and practice and help reduce the risk of such learning being repeated. By promoting a culture of openness, honesty, and evidence-based learning, churches can be empowered to learn from each other and provide strong leadership in good safeguarding practice. I urge Synod to endorse the responses. Safeguarding is at the heart of our mission. Survivors need to see concrete actions to rebuild their trust in our church. I am hopeful that the responses and strategy being put in place by the National Safeguarding Team, where survivors are at the centre, will help the church to redress past actions and, more importantly, use past learning to improve the leadership and management of future safeguarding. Thank you.
After the Bishop of Burnley, the Bishop of Huddersfield to move his amendment.
Philip North, Bishop of Burnley, number 50. The recommendations that flow from the ICSA report are quite specific and quite detailed, and they're well addressed in GS 2158. But I would really urge people to read the whole report, one that raises vastly wider issues. It's essential reading, and I was really blown away by the impact that reading it had on me and on my colleagues in the Blackburn Diocese. Why? I think it's because the ICSA report enables us to see the church through the eyes of survivors. Those who watched the Peter Ball documentary on BBC 2 a few weeks ago will find it did exactly the same. We had a really powerful Bible study this morning in which Isabel Hamley called for this so strongly, for us to see the church through the eyes of the powerless. And that's what this report enables us to do, I think. And we need to pay vast tribute to the survivors for their courage. They are, in my view, prophets calling us to greater gospel faithfulness. As I read the ICSA report, I found myself more and more reflecting on power, its use and abuse, and indeed on the power I hold myself as a bishop. As bishops, as priests, as lay leaders, we tend not to think of ourselves as powerful. We're instead often aware of the limits of our power. We're too aware of what we can't do because of complex legal structures and the inherited traditions of the Church of England. Or we affect a kind of faux humility, which is very much the tactic of Peter Ball. And that's the danger. Hidden power, opaque structures of power, ill-defined patterns of accountability are very easy to abuse or to take advantage of. These are important recommendations in front of us. I'm sure we'll embrace them wholeheartedly. But this is only the beginning of a response to one of the most forensic external analyses the Church of England has ever undergone. And I think there's two things we need to continue to consider in order to make power more transparent and strengthen accountability. The first is clergy terms and conditions of service. Freehold is demonstrably a safeguarding disaster. I'm not sure that common tenure is much better. We must ask ourselves very honestly if better defined, more transparent professional relationships would make for greater accountability and a safer church. The safety of children and vulnerable adults must trump even cherished traditions. And the second is a joined up and externally accountable safeguarding service. I worry deeply that the current arrangements lack the strength or coherence that we need to hold church leaders to account. In fact, in my view, they're dangerously fragmented. Every diocese, most cathedrals have their own teams with different employers. Then we have a national team. Then we have professional advisors whose relationships to DSAs and cathedral advisors is undefined. Often different safeguarding teams will give contradictory advice or will interpret guidelines in different ways. There are huge complexities when, as often happens, a safeguarding case impacts on numerous dioceses. And of course, in a deeply financially unequal church, there may always be the temptation for poorer dioceses to cut. There's simply too much fragmentation. And fragmentation creates gaps that manipulative people can crawl into. I'd suggest it's time that we tupid safeguarding staff across to a single, independently scrutinized national safeguarding service so that they're not employed by those whom they're meant to be holding to account, with all the clashes of loyalty that may encourage. I'm extremely grateful to the Bishop of Bath and Wells, to the National Safeguarding Team, to all others who've put so much work into GS 2158. And I look forward to that same willingness to listen and to reform being brought to bear as we continue to engage with ICSA. Thank you.
The Bishop of Huddersfield to speak to and move his amendment at item 48.
Thank you, Chair. Jonathan Gibbs, Huddersfield 51. I would like to begin with some words of thanks. Firstly, echoing the Archbishop of Canterbury, to Bishop Peter for all that he has done as lead bishop for safeguarding over the last 4 years, and specifically today for his introduction to this debate. We are, as we have shown, profoundly grateful for his personal commitment to leadership in this vital work and for bringing us to this point today. Secondly, to those members of Synod who proposed amendments to the main motion last week and for the way in which these helped focus everyone's minds on where we must go from here. Without going into all the details, we've had some very constructive conversations over the last week or so, and these led to the revised amendment which you have before you today. The words are not the same, but the underlying intention is. And I'm very grateful for the support of those members in bringing today's amendment. Thirdly, and most importantly, to the members of the survivor community who have spoken out so courageously and done all they can to hold us to account. We owe them a huge and continuing debt in so many ways. So, to the content of my amendment, which is proposed on behalf of the NSSG following our meeting last week, and which is intended to supplement as well as to endorse the terms of the original motion, all of which is important and needs to be said. Clause B of the amendment welcomes the fact that the NSSG remains committed to ensuring that words of apology are followed by concrete actions. Synod. We all know that the season of apology and lament is by no means over. But now is also the time for action and for change. Clause C begins to outline what that will look like, including, crucially, our developing a more survivor-centered approach to safeguarding. That means hearing what survivors are saying and trying to see things through their eyes. It means recognizing that the world looks and feels different to those of us who have suffered trauma and abuse. And it means working together with survivors to reshape how we go about the shared life of the church. And that is vital. Because frankly, too many of us, too often, still just don't get it. Clause C also speaks of arrangements for redress for survivors. This is a small phrase, but with big implications. It will mean money, serious money, and we will need to work out how we're going to fund that. But it must also mean changes in the way we handle claims and complaints, so that how we do things is shaped by the righteousness and compassion of God's kingdom and not by the short-term and short-sighted financial and reputational interests of the church. Finally, Clause D looks to the future and to the final ICSA report. That report will not make comfortable reading, and nor should it. And we must be ready to respond promptly and fully to the report as Clause D requires. But we need to do more than that. And we should be looking right now to go beyond whatever ICSA says and to commit ourselves to making the Church of England into what it should be, namely a beacon of excellence in safeguarding, recognized as a community that excels in promoting the safety and well-being of every single human being, and one that acts as a voice for the voiceless and a refuge for the vulnerable. Synod, now is the time for action and for change. And I commend this amendment to you as an expression of our shared commitment. I move the amendment, standing in my name.
The Bishop of Bath and Wells, as the mover of the main motion, to comment on the amendment.
I thank Jonathan for his very powerful and very clear speech. I endorse everything he says, and I hope that Synod will vote very clearly and firmly to accept the amendment.
The Bishop has accepted the amendment, so debate continues on item 48. Canon Rosie Harper, followed by the Bishop of London.
Could I please just check what the time limit is?
It remains 5 minutes, Canon Harper.
Thank you very much. Rosie Harper, Oxford, 190. In this short speech, I hope I will be able to say some of the things about why these amendments are really seriously needed. Because my question at the moment to the archbishops and to the bishops is very simple. What has really changed? A couple of years ago, I asked a question in this House wanting to know in what ways the bishops could be held accountable for implementing their promises. I'm afraid I received a very patronising answer along the lines of, "Trust me, I'm a bishop." And of course, at a deep level, nothing did change. I can see that there's a lot more process, as we've just heard this morning, and as a parish priest, I'm certainly doing a lot more courses and a shed load more paperwork, and that is good, and it's raised the general level of awareness considerably. But what hasn't changed yet is how survivors feel about the church response. They are still waiting for a genuine Christian and human interaction. They know full well, because the institution is so leaky, that they are still spoken about as difficult, or persistent and vexatious, or tricky, or damaged. And they wait. They wait for apologies, they wait for fair and just restitution, and they wait for proper pastoral care. And in the case, for example, of UN survivors, they even wait for an honest and truthful investigation into the whole barbaric abuse to actually be undertaken. Some survivors have lost income and life savings in their process of fighting injustice and dishonesty, and they're still waiting for their lives to be rebuilt. Last week, a UN survivor made a heartfelt plea. It has been 7 years, they wrote. 7 years. There needs to be a culture change, and it needs to start at the top. Because big public apologies come easy, even tearful ones, which incidentally make the apology about the person apologising, not the survivor. Genuine personal apologies seem to be more difficult, even when the people concerned are in the same room as one another. Will the House of Bishops please work out how to make the Archbishop's promise to put the survivors at the heart of what we do a reality to which they will be held accountable in a measurable way with consequences for ongoing failure, a tangible reality that survivors can see and know. But as the full ICSA report will doubtless demonstrate, we are still on the nursery slopes. Thank you.
After the Bishop of London, Mr. Sewell.
Thank you very much for calling me. 003 London, Sarah Mullally. Safeguarding from abuse and responding well, I believe, is grounded in the fundamental themes of Christian theology. Thereby, it should be woven into the church. Churches should be places where all are welcomed into. They should be open and secure communities that make Christ's reconciling peace known. And I do personally lament that in the past we have failed to do this. I do think that over the last few years there have been changes, better resourcing, new policies, better procedures, training has improved. There have been audits of all dioceses in the Church of England undertaken by the Social Care Institute for Excellence. And I do see some change in culture. But I also continue to hear the voices of survivors and victims of abuse who say we have not moved quickly enough. And I am sorry if I have been part of their frustration. But as I think ICSIS reflected on the day in which I attended, that no one person can do this alone. The House of Bishops can't do this alone. We are all, every one of us, involved in culture change. Culture change is about the way we do things around here. Culture change does not happen, and the way we do things around here does not change unless it is owned by each one of us who is part of the culture. Anything less would turn what are behaviours of the heart into something that is a bureaucratic checklist. Culture change, I've observed, is more successful if it is clearly led by its leaders, when behaviours are reinforced by training, communication, and audit. But maybe most importantly, change is only successful if we understand what good looks like. And we can only understand what good looks like if we work with survivors and victims of clerical abuse. And actually, if we are to properly involve survivors and victims of clerical abuse, we do need to properly resource this, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of skills. And therefore, I would encourage each one of us to think very carefully when we come to vote on this motion and the amendment, and particularly C. Because by voting for it, which I will, says that we will properly refund the involvement of survivors and victims. And I don't just mean redress. If we are to work together, to work with them so they enable us to know what good looks like, we have to properly resource and fund this. I'd also want to add my support to the Bishop of Burnley. If we are to properly understand our power, our lines of accountability and responsibilities, I do believe that we need to review common tenure and freehold, because until we do that, we will struggle to hold account and to understand our responsibilities. And maybe a final comment about our struggle with amendments here at synods. The voices of survivors and victims may never be in order, and maybe I'm thankful for that. But we do have to hear the voices of victims and survivors. So it is us, Synod and the Church of England, that need to change, and not their ability to navigate synodical processes and the Church of England. Together, we are involved in transformation. Together, we are involved in transformation, which I do believe has begun. But I know that we are not there. And I long to see, and my prayer continues to be, that we will see changes of the heart and of the way we do things around here. So I will vote for both this motion and the amendments, and I will commit myself to continue to persevere. Thank you.
After Mrs. Sewell, Mrs. Leaf.
Martin Sewell, Rochester 391. Thank you for calling me chair. My friends, I ask you to support the amendment and the motion, and I'd like to explain the importance of what lies behind the mere text. The words may still look a bit bland, but let me unpack why they matter, to explore the spirit of the amendment and show you some of the hope that lies latent within it, and especially within that little word, redress. It's common knowledge here that Peter, David, and I would have liked stronger words. But all three of us have experience in mediating acrimonious disputes. And if that collective experience has taught us anything, it is that usually it's more important that there is agreement than that any part of the agreement should be insisted upon. For us, delivering bishops, church authorities, synod, and most importantly of all, survivors of our sin, to a place where we have an outline for moving forward together is already a real achievement by Bishop Jonathan, one to be thankful for and one to be grasped. In a very real sense, when you record your vote today, as I think we all should do it on record, we will be pressing the reset button. Last week, Bishop Jonathan acted decisively, encouraging his colleagues to accept that the initial motion was nowhere good enough. It wasn't a proper response to the Peter Paul story. Anger and frustration is widespread, not only amongst survivors, but also in the church itself. The decent people in the pews have heard and they want action. So we began to insist that Synod needed to say more than the bare minimum of acceptance of the ICSA criticism and recommendations. Nothing says that better than that little word, redress. Doesn't sound much, but it means a lot. For victims, it means hope. It means binding up the wounds of those victims beyond what the lawyers advised. It implies actively nurturing our victims back to as much wholeness as possible in a host of ways, even if they never can forgive us. Christ requires nothing less. Ask the Good Samaritan for details. Don't ask the Levite, and don't ask the reputational management consultant. Promising this was one thing. Getting the survivors to believe that they might just dare to begin to consider the possibility of fundamental change in this place is quite another. Bishop Jonathan has won their provisional trust. They're thinking about giving us, once again, the precious gift of their hope. Don't let any of us professing Christians here dare to think about letting them down again. Bishop Jonathan told us yesterday that at the Safeguarding Fringe that he's talked to his colleagues and he assures us that they know that restorative justice will be costly, and to their great credit, he tells us they accept it is the right thing to do because our God is a God of justice and mercy, and if there are two qualities that are needed now, it is surely justice and mercy. All this is within that little idea, those few words in that amendment. Do you remember Father Ranieri Cantalamessa's sermon at the beginning of this synod? Restoring he told us to rebuild my house. I've written overnight to some of you about it. That commission is not just about restoring the structures, but it's also about restoring the penitent, us. Putting our money where our mouths are is part of that too. Our God is one whose actions speak louder than words. In his presidential address, Archbishop Justin spoke well of love in action. That's precisely what I've been talking about here. Owning our failures is love in action. Giving proper apologies, however delayed, is love in action. No more delay is love in action. Costly reparation is costly love in action. And whilst we were doing this, if you hear the faint sound of a lion roaring, do not be alarmed. It's not the devil like a lion abroad seeking whom he may devour. It's the sound of Aslan on the march, and we all know what that means. My friends, the ice is cracking. Come with us on this journey of penitence and hope.
After Mrs. Leaf, the Venerable Junie Connolty.
Susie Leaf, Truro 421. I had thought that many would stand. I thought my voice wouldn't be needed. And I wonder if we all feel too small, too powerless, because I know I do. I've been on a journey myself in the depths of the safeguarding world. And I want to start by apologising to all the survivors and all of the victims, not just of abuse that we see in the ICSA report, but of episcopal and archiepiscopal bullying, because some of us have remained silent for too long. 4 things, perhaps, that I've learned over the last couple of years. 1, listen. Listen to the smallest comment and let people speak. I had a phone call from a clergyman who's now a long way from this country after the announcement of Jonathan Fletcher's abuse. And he said to me, Well, we know that he could be a bully, but we know he could be a bully, but, and I said, listen to that. What shepherd is a bully? What have we let ourselves be part of? Second, speak up. Even when some suggest that to speak might be unhelpful. Even when you don't know what to say, speak up. Thirdly, put the survivors first. Tribes go out the window. Listen to what they have to say. Allow them to shape our response. Fourthly, conceal nothing. We all want to cover up our sin, but it will all be known one day. It will all be revealed, and we will all stand in judgment. But wonderfully, now is the time for redemption. Now is the time of mercy. Conceal nothing and bring it to the Lord and to the world. And finally, take responsibility. Bishop North talked about hidden power and ill-defined patterns of accountability. We've seen victim blaming. So please make change happen. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the gospel does not need defending. It doesn't need our support. God is big enough, and he calls us to be faithful, to love mercy, and to act justly. This will be my last speech to Synod, and safeguarding as far as the Church of England will no longer be my responsibility. I may be leaving the Church of England, but I won't be leaving survivors. This is for all of us, for all our responsibility. So please, listen, speak up, put the survivors first, conceal nothing, and take responsibility. Thank you.
After the Archdeacon, Mr. Adams.
Julie Connolty, Rochester 199. My declaration of interest is Bishop's lead for safeguarding in Rochester, and as a member of clergy in the Church of England, a constant feeling of being conflicted. I wanted to just speak briefly about that word redress. I think it does give us a glimmer of hope. Most importantly, of course, it gives a glimmer of hope to survivors. But I'm a Charlton Athletic fan. We have a saying, I'm sure many of you do, that it's not the despair that kills you, it's the hope. We particularly remember that when we've thrown away a 2-0 lead. That's important to remember. Survivors have suffered in terms of mental health and physical health. They've lost families and relationships and homes and jobs and secure retirements. If we are serious about redress, if we are serious about offering hope, then we must not fail to deliver on that. Failure to deliver on hope kills, quite literally. I've been doing some hand-wringing recently. We're often accused of that in the church, and I realized last week, in conversation with a survivor, that I'd been up to it too. I'd been bemoaning privately and among friends the derisory payments that have been made to survivors of church context abuse. And I've been waiting for the national church to take action about that. But I'd forgotten that I am well placed within my diocese to ask some very difficult questions, as are many others of you in this room. So I spoke at Bishop's Council and just raised this. Because surely within our diocese we have the capacity to go further than a full and final settlement. Surely we have the capacity to do justly, to act mercifully, and even to be generous. Surely we have the capacity to question our insurers about their practices, and indeed our lawyers. It occurred to me that actually we can change insurers if we don't think their methods are ethical. I changed my electricity supplier. I am hoping that when I go back to my diocese, some of my colleagues, and I'm sure they will be asking me some very difficult questions in diocesan synod. I urge you, synod members, don't just wait for the national church. Survivors are watching and wanting to help us. But we must not hold out hope and disappoint them. We must go back to our diocese and do something.
After Mr. Adams, I shall test the mind of Synod on a motion for closure on item 48.
Chair, are we still on 5 minutes or 3?
We are still on 5 minutes, Mr.
Thank you.
Adams.
Peter Adams, St Albans 392. Synod, I welcome the motion and especially the amendments. I believe it sets a platform from which our new lead bishop for safeguarding can take us forward. Thank you, Bishop. I know the words apology, concrete action, survivor-centred response and redress are music to our survivors' ears. Synod, the ICSA inquiry has been deeply painful for the Church. It's vital we embrace the whole process as deeply and widely as we can. We need to take on board these 5 recommendations, and we need to go so much further now. Central to so much of ICSA's hearings has been the Church's handling of disclosures of abuse. How has it happened that as a Church we've allowed ourselves to become mired in the mess of failure to respond appropriately? My desire today is not to apportion blame. The whole Church, as we've heard from Susie Leith, has been silent for too long on this and left it to our bishops. I think it's too much for them to bear. General Synod now needs to add its weight to this issue as clearly as possible. I sat with a survivor last week. Robert was sexually and physically abused between aged 9 and 13 while at a cathedral choir school in the early 1960s. He's not been part of MACSAS or the other survivors' networks. In his words, the cathedral was heaven to me from the first time I went for voice trials. The choir master led me into the nave. He asked me to sing a high note, and to my amazement, the echoes danced around the expanse of this vast building. I felt as an 8-year-old I had heard the voice of an angel, and that somehow that would please God my Father. But then that cathedral became the place I was abused multiple times. When I left age 13, it was like I said goodbye to my Father in heaven. On the brink of suicide at 18, I came to a personal faith. Over the years, I've occasionally visited, but found it very difficult to go to an Anglican church. I broke down on going into a cathedral. I had such a surge of emotions. 3 years ago, I told my story to the ICSA Truth Project. Then 2 years ago, I met with the dean in the cathedral where I'd been abused. last year, in my mid-60s, I was at last able to go and sing Evensong there. Robert's is, to be frank, one of the good stories. I wish there were many more. Today, Robert works in prisons with men who've been abused. He has a deep and profound understanding of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder experienced by victims of abuse. We spoke of the lifelong impact of that trauma and PTSD and the way that trauma impacts people differently. Talk to any of the dear men and women who have been gracious enough to spend time with us, and you will see that. Some have found coping mechanisms that allow them to live relatively normal lives on the surface, though depression and dark times come on unexpectedly and too often. But others find it hard to keep down a job decades after their abuse. Almost all tell on how disclosing life gets harder, and even more so when they're not believed or obstructed again and again. For some, their anger can lead easily to being dismissed as not serious about resolution. But none choose the way they present. It is a consequence of their abuse, of their trauma. Some have retained faith like Robert, but expressed it in another church. Some, amazingly, have found a home amongst us. Many struggle with faith. Most struggle financially. We need to learn from our survivors and from experts in trauma and PTSD and how we can make it easier for them for those who've been so deeply wounded and still need appropriate redress. Survivors of child sexual abuse in our midst will carry the impact of that trauma throughout their lives. Nothing we will do will change that. But today we can lay a foundation for a response that will make that journey easier. Thank you.
So, under Standing Order 31, I put a motion for closure to the Synod on item 48. Would all those in favour please show? And would all those against please show? That's very clearly carried. Thank you. So we now return to item 9 as amended by item 48. I'm so sorry. We move to a vote on item 48. All those in favour please show. All those against, please show. That is very clearly carried. So we now return to item 9 as amended by item 48. The Bishop of Gloucester, followed by Mr. Freeman. The Bishop of Gloucester will have 5 minutes. The speech limit thereafter will be 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Rachel Treweek, Gloucester 19. A title I find it quite awkward to hold in this debate. As has already been said, safeguarding is integral to our mission and ministry. It's not an add-on issue, just as other things we've talked about in Living in Love and Faith yesterday and in the Windrush legacy are not add-on issues. Our failure in each of these areas is our failure to be the church, Christ's body here on earth. Our failure to live the good news of the kingdom of God. Creation is groaning, longing for the freedom of the children of God. 2 years ago, in February 2018, I took part in a presentation here at General Synod, again on safeguarding, and we had the Gibb report in front of us. That report published in 2017. Following the publication of that report, and again after the ICSA inquiry into Peter Ball, I publicly express my views not only regarding the horrific abuse of one of my predecessors,
but also regarding the appalling failure of bishops and an archbishop at the time who failed to care for those who came forward, who failed to put survivors at the centre. I repeated that again recently following the documentary on Peter Ball, and I once again want to publicly particularly pay tribute to the tenacity and courage of Neil Todd, who sadly is not with us today. I was glad that so many people expressed deep shock following the BBC documentary, and yet in so many of the comments I received or read after people had watched the documentary or seen my response, it was as if some people were absorbing it for the first time. And that in itself has perturbed me. There were hardly any new facts in that powerful BBC documentary. Almost all of what we saw had been in the Gibb report, had been in the public domain after the ICSA inquiry. And that says something to me about our learning. We need to show that we are learning from the past. I am in favour of reviews. It's very important we give due attention to what has gone wrong in the past. Indeed, we agreed to do that yesterday in our debate around the Windrush legacy. But if we are going to learn from reviews and inquiries, then lament and regret and apology are not enough, as the amendment today has said. These reviews and inquiries must be read and absorbed by all of us, not simply filed away. They must ask searching questions which change us as individuals and worshipping communities and as a national church, all of us. One of the things that concerns me around case reviews is that I wonder how well we test what we have learnt. How does it go deep within us as we live the body of Christ together, all of us? I wholeheartedly have endorsed the recommendations today, and I'm grateful for them because they challenge us more fully regarding our learning and our accountability to each other. The past, the present and future need to be held together in much greater tension. We do need to get process and structures and policies right. We do need to put money into all that is needed. And we need to find ways of testing together how what we have learned from reviews and indeed all that training, how is it changing us in the present, which is not simply about process, but is about something much deeper. When it comes to money, there have been discussions in this chamber regarding how we use money that we're fortunate to have from the past and how we spend it now in the present, very aware that we are spending the money of the church of the future. There have been lots of discussions around that, particularly in relation to strategic development. However, when it comes to safeguarding, it's surely right that we have appallingly failed people in the past, so money needs to be spent in the present to ensure that how we live now in the present and the future continues to look very different when it comes to flourishing of all people made in the image of God. So my question is, how do we truly learn and ensure reviews are not simply part of process, but that they change us in the present and for the future?
After Mr. Freeman, the lady at the back of the chamber. Thank you.
John Freeman, 278 Chester, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling me. I stand here as one who was subject to sexual abuse as a school child. The schools are much better than the church at getting on with it. The head teacher involved spent time in jail because people told the authorities. Since then, as chairman of governors in schools, we have had members of staff who've been accused. They have been suspended immediately. They have been investigated. There was no substance in the claim, and they came back. I've also, as a leader of a committee in a community centre, had someone who was apprehended by the boys in blue. He never crossed the premises again, and he was also a school governor elsewhere, and he never crossed those. Do something straight away. Don't hang about. That's been half the church's problem. I know it is difficult with members of the clergy, with all the problems of freehold, etc., that have been brought to our attention by the bishops of Burnley and London, but whatever else, get on with it now. Don't drag your feet. Thank you very much.
After the next speaker, to whom I apologise not being able to call you by name, the Reverend Sir George Newton.
Emily Bagg, Portsmouth 384. Chair, I hadn't intended to speak, but as one of those 1 in 20 that Bishop Peter spoke of earlier, abused by my church, I wanted to stand to support this motion, albeit slightly cautiously. I am not a victim. I am a survivor. Words are not enough. We can talk and we can promise and we can promise and we can talk. But concrete actions are all that really matter to people like me. Concrete, real, immediate action. Synod, please support this motion. But absolutely, vitally, be prepared to put your money where your mouths are. To totally, utterly, and radically take real, concrete action. Thank you.
I apologise to Mr. Friend, who from this particular vantage point looked like Mr. Newton. Mr. Friend, if you would like to speak now. Speech limit remains 3 minutes.
Simon Friend, Exeter 310. I want to acknowledge the presence of survivors here, both in the chamber and in the gallery. And I want to say to those in the gallery that I saw your poster, and I think it's vitally important you keep asking awkward questions. I think it's vitally important that we in the chamber feel uncomfortable and continue to feel uncomfortable until you feel comfortable and that your questions are answered. I also want to reflect on the word lament that has been used, not just today, but yesterday. And I wonder what it means for us as a body to truly lament. After reading the ISCA report and watching the documentaries, I've, like many, was deeply sorrowful at what people have been through at the hands of us here representing this institution. And the words sackcloth and ashes, I don't believe we've begun to understand what that would look like for us now and in this age. This is a very cerebral chamber. We talk, we think, we write, but somehow we need to embody lament. And somehow we need to find a way of embodying the sorrow that we all feel. And the words that come from the Archbishop and Bishop Peter and those in senior leadership are very, very welcome. But actually those of us who are on the ground, we also need to enter into this lament. So I would encourage us that we need to find a way to embody that as an institution.
Mrs. Boggs, followed by Mr. Lamming.
Debbie Boggs, London 353. Simon Friend has just alluded to the poster. For the record, for those outside of the chamber and for those reading a record of the proceedings, I'd like to just say that it said that 23.5 million has been allocated to the Lambeth Palace Library, the new building, and nothing has been allocated for redress. Thank you.
After Mr. Lamming, the Archdeacon of London.
David Lamming, St Edmund in Ipswich, 399. Thank you for calling me, and thank you, first of all, may I endorse thanks to Bishop Peter for all the work that he has done, including behind the scenes, over the last 4 years. Synod has already expressed its gratitude. I want personally to add mine to that, and also to welcome Bishop Jonathan, because Jonathan is committed to carrying the work forward. And that leads me to what I want to say first of all about the amendment that we've now added to the motion. Yesterday afternoon, we spent quite a lot of time about rules. I make no apology for that. But today is not about rules, it's about justice and doing justice. And the amendment which Peter Adams and I sought to have added to the motion last week, and you'll have read the report in the Church Times about it and its rejection last Friday, has led happily to what is now before us. As a result of Bishop Jonathan's lead at the NSSG and the feeling amongst the members of the NSSG that the rather, for want of a better word, bland motion that we originally had on the order paper unamended needed to be expanded, needed to acknowledge the fact that we needed to be survivor-centred in our approach to safeguarding in these issues. You may remember that last summer in York, Martin Sewell and I sought to have added to the agenda a motion welcoming the Blackburn ad clerum letter. That required the consent of the two archbishops pursuant to standing orders. And Archbishop Justin understandably felt, first of all, that it was premature till people had had an opportunity to read the ICSA report, and secondly, because the ICSA hearing was going on concurrently with the York Synod, there weren't the right people at York at the time. Now, happily, we have that opportunity. And what I'd like to do is just share with you some of the words of that Blackburn ad clerum letter, to which, of course, Bishop Philip North was one of the signatories. What they said in part was this: the church should be the conscience of the nation, and yet, as the ICSA report shows, again and again we have placed the reputation of the institution above the needs of the vulnerable. In addition, when the contemporary church fails to respond properly to allegations from the past, this becomes a form of re-abuse, adding a fresh layer of hurt and harm to those whose lives are already damaged. Trite, formulaic responses will not do. There has been grave sin within the church, and unless corporately we name, confess, and deal with that sin, our mission to the nation is fatally undermined. Members of Synod, time has run out. May I just conclude with a quote from Professor Munro: a concern with doing things right against a concern with doing the right things. Today, we must do the right things. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. After the Archdeacon of London, the Archdeacon of Lincoln.
Luke Miller, 162, London. Faced with the realisation of evil and the need for us all to deeply and properly repent and take new and concrete action that such things can never happen again, we are left with a need to work out how then to act. I am a parish priest as well as being an archdeacon, and stand therefore at both ends of the communication process, something which has been difficult, and I apologise when sometimes my communication has not been as good as it might have been. Clarity is needed as the culture changes about what it means that we should be doing, as Canon Harper points out, amidst the plethora of training and the paperwork with which we are now faced. Recommendation 4 points to the need for all those in regulated activity to have a DBS check. But in the variety of activity in our churches, not only for clergy, but for whom things are pretty clear, but also for our lay volunteers. There is a real difficulty of definition and a need for real clarity of advice. Despite the best efforts of our diocesan safeguarding teams, and thanks to them, it still feels on the ground amongst so many parish clergy to be unclear, to be confusing, to be uncertain about what should be done. One church I know sought to appoint an organist who would from time to time, but not very often, go to the Sunday school. They required a DBS check, but then they got a solicitor's letter from a former offenders group saying that they had broken the law and threatening to take the parish priest to court. Parish clergy can feel caught, trying to do the right thing, but trapped in what feels like a maze. We must put survivors first and prevent further abuse. Those of us at the centre bear a strong responsibility to continue to work hard to try to get this right so that people don't feel that they are hung out to dry or left in an impossible position. Where I've got that wrong, I apologise. I apologise mainly to those who may be at threat or who have been harmed or abused, but I also apologise to those who are trying to get this right but finding it difficult. Synod, we need to help one another to get this right, so that for the sake of our clergy, but more than that, for the sake of those who have or might be abused, we need to work together in order that real clarity can be given about precisely what are we to do.
After the Archdeacon of Lincoln, I shall test the mind of the Synod on a motion for closure.
Kirk Lincoln 151, and I declare an interest as a member of the National Safeguarding Steering Group. I welcome this report and each one of its recommendations, but I want to suggest two further ones in order that we may put, as we've been encouraged to do, our money where our mouth is. As an archdeacon, you might anticipate they'll be structural. In no sense do I want to divert Synod's attention from survivors and victims. The first thing I think we need to do is to underscore and to strengthen the independence of diocesan safeguarding advisors. Some of them have experienced being disregarded, marginalized, their work interfered with or compromised, their advice disregarded. And so I wonder whether the term advisor is the most appropriate one for their role. We don't have advisors in finance, do we? Or advisors in education, advisors for ordinands. Perhaps we should have directors of safeguarding with all that that new title would mean. And when an advisor gives advice and people fail to follow it, please could we have a one-stop route for blowing the whistle there and then? If the archdeacon or the bishop or whoever is correct in disregarding the advice, that will come out in due course. But let's no longer have professionals and not listen to their advice. And the second is about formation. We are still some way short, as colleagues have said, of the whole church realizing that safeguarding is an every member responsibility. I believe we need a significant investment in the formation of clergy and lay ministers in order fully to embed the culture of safeguarding to which we all aspire. At theological college or training institutions, you have exams or essays in biblical studies and missiology, philosophy, ethics, and all the rest, but none in safeguarding. It's possible to fail systematic theology, but no one yet fails safeguarding. Surely we need that same rigor in respect of those we're going to place in positions of authority. Please, Synod, endorse this report resoundingly, but let's not leave it there.
before I put the motion for closure, I'd be glad to hear from Canon Spence.
John Spence, Archbishop's Council, 467. As your finance chairman, I've listened to points being made about money needing to be spent and about allocations being made for libraries or other things. Let us be very clear. This is not about affordability, it is about justice. Justice cannot have a different value depending on the finances of this or that diocese. Whatever we are told is required by those responsible, that is required for redress, then those funds will be found. Thank you.
Understanding Order 31, I put the motion for closure on item 9 to the Synod. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against, please show. That is very clearly carried. So I invite the Bishop of Bath and Wells to respond to the debate. Bishop, we'd be grateful if you could do that within 5 minutes.
Thank you to Synod, all those who've spoken, all those who've listened, and all those who've engaged in various ways today. Can I just make one or two closing comments, and particularly words of thanks. Archbishop, thank you for your gracious words to me. More important to me was the very clear commitment that you made as you lead us here in Synod. I'm very grateful to Martin Sewell, to David Lamming, and to Peter Evans, and to Jonathan Gibbs for bringing the amendment to us, which has allowed us to speak freely on much wider and more significant matters. I'm grateful to Kashmir Garten, calling us to increased professionalism, saying very prophetically, survivors need to see concrete actions to rebuild trust in the church, and a call for redress that others echoed subsequently. Philip North, a forensic analysis of the church, a lack of strength and coherence, a worry about fragmentation, structures inadequate, and he set out the reasons for that. Jonathan Gibbs, I know deep in your heart, is a survivor-centred approach to safeguarding. We thank you for that. We thank you for the work that you've been doing and the work you will do. And you've called us to be, as a church, a voice for the voiceless and an agent for change. Rosie Harper posed that hard question, what has changed? And reminded us that culture change was needed and the tangible reality of actions. The Bishop of London reminded us that we've not moved quickly enough and reminded us that significant resources are needed. Martin Sewell, you've given us something to think about when you talk about pressing the reset button. And as you spoke about the meaning of redress, you reminded us that there are those who might just begin to dare to think about hope. And you spoke about a God of justice and hope. You spoke about the love of Christ in action. You said that the ice is cracking and that Aslan was on the march. May that be true, and may we in Synod do what we can to further that. Susie Leaf spoke very personally, gave us much to think about, and amongst the 4 things she said, she asked us to listen and to let people speak, and said that we too need to take responsibility for speaking up. Julie Connerty talked about Charlton Athletic and the failure to deliver hope is what kills. You asked some very difficult questions of us, and you've said you will continue to ask difficult questions. We seek to follow your example. Peter Adams, you gave us a very harrowing story of Robert, but you gave us some prophetic words, words of hope, and you spoke about laying a foundation, and we thank you for that. Rachel Treweek, you spoke about our failure to be and our failure to live out the good news. You said that lament and apology and regret were not enough. You talked about the need to make sure that in the church we're concerned for all the flourishing of God's people. John Freeman, your speeches always attract applause. You told us not to drag our feet. We underline that. Emily Bagg, courageously speaking to us this morning, called from your own experience for concrete, real and immediate action. Simon Friend reminded us, as others have done, the importance of keep asking awkward questions. You spoke about embodying lament and sorrow, going beyond the outer action to the heart. Debbie Buggs, you read from the poster that was unveiled and you spoke about the cost. David Lamming, in many of the wonderful things you said, you also said this was not about rules, which Synod is good at, but it's about justice. Luke Miller, you called for greater clarity. Gavin Kirk, you spoke about the need to strengthen the diocesan resources and embedding a culture of safeguarding right across the Church of England. You called us to go further. And John Spence, you ended by giving us some reassurances about finance that are most welcome today. Perhaps I can try and sum up our debate with three observations. The first has been the importance of a victim-centered response. Some of us were in the chamber earlier this morning when we were being led through a Bible study on 1 Peter chapter 3, and we were asked, what was the verse that stood out for us? For me, it was this verse. Do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with blessing. In the motion before us, we're seeking to repay with blessing. The second thing, and I know the Business Committee will be already aware of this, that ICSAR and the ICSA recommendations are important for our own life. We need to make adequate space to hear, to listen, and to debate the words they'll bring to us. And then concrete actions are needed to follow our votes and our statements, and that needs significant resources. With those thoughts, I commend this motion, amended as it is, to Synod, and trust that we will once again give it our unequivocal support. Thank you, Chair.
Before we move to a vote, I invite the Synod to wait upon God for a space in silence. Loving God, we pray that your church may be a place of welcome, security, and compassion. Keep us watchful yet caring, trusting yet ready to question, that all may live your risen life in safety and in the knowledge of your saving love, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So we now move to a vote on item 9 as amended. Point of order, I think Canon White.
In view of the importance of this issue to those outside the House, would you order a counting vote to the whole Synod?
It's within my discretion to order such a vote, a count of the whole Synod under Standing Orders 37, and I so do. Bit of a duff bell. This is a vote on item 9. This is a vote on item 9 as amended by item 48. So it's a counted vote of the whole synod. Those in favour should press 1. Those against should press 2. Those who wish to record an abstention should press 3.
The voting period is now open and will end in 1 minute.
If only. Quite.
The voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has now ended.
They're voted on item 9 as amended by item 48. 361 in favour, with no votes against and no recorded abstentions. The motion is clearly carried. That concludes this item of business. Thank you.
Brothers and sisters, we now come to item 10 on our agenda, our debate on climate emergency and carbon reduction target. You will need your paper GS 2159 for this debate, and I can see as I speak that the 13th notice paper on the financial statement is being distributed in the chamber. There, as you can see from your order paper, there are 5 amendments to consider today, and there has been considerable interest in this item, which of course is a very good thing. I want to hear as many people as possible today, so just to give you an idea of how the debate's going to go, I'm going to have a few speeches on the main motion first, and then we will move fairly early on to the amendments. Apart from the Bishop of Salisbury, when he comes to introduce this debate, there will be a speech limit of 3 minutes from the outset. So I now call on the Bishop of Salisbury to speak to and move his motion. Bishop, you have up to 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Holtham, Salisbury, 36. There is a climate emergency. It's a crisis for God's creation and a fundamental injustice. It's raised big questions from young people about whether people of my generation really care about intergenerational fairness. It raises big questions about climate justice, as well as about our creativity and spirituality in relation to God and the earth. This graphic was produced by Professor Ed Hawkins, a meteorologist from Reading University. It shows the annual average temperatures for the Earth from 1850 to 2018. One stripe represents 1 year. The blue colours are cold years, the red stripes are hot years. Coming to the present, the stripes get redder and darker, showing that the planet is warming up about 1 to 1.1 degrees across the period. But it is accelerating. There is now no serious doubt that climate change is happening and that people are causing climate change. The 2015 UN Paris Agreement aimed to limit global warming caused by people to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and not more than 2 degrees. Currently, we're heading for more than 3 degrees. The impact is seen in melting ice in the Arctic. Sea levels have risen by 25 centimetres. The bushfires in Australia have caught our attention. Even in the UK, we are experiencing more extreme weather events. We met in the aftermath of Storm Ciara, and we depart into Storm Dennis. Fossil fuels, carbon, and what we now know as to be greenhouse gases have brought enormous good. They're now doing great damage. In this changing context, we are having to rethink the theology of creation and our spirituality about how to live in God's gift of creation. The poorest are most immediately affected, which is why the development agencies have climate justice as their top priority. Incremental change is not going to be enough. This year, we have some big opportunities to make a step change in thought and action, particularly because the UK is hosting the UN Climate Change Summit in Glasgow in November. Whoever is presiding over it, that conference is particularly significant 5 years after Paris. As with Paris, national and international networks are preparing the churches and faith communities to support and to challenge our governments and politicians in effecting a change like the Industrial Revolution, but this time led by a crisis in which for the first time we're giving up resources that are still readily available in the ground, but which are damaging the climate. We need creative, new world thinking, not old world thoughtlessness. The Church of England has launched #LiveLent, Care for God's Creation. The booklets for adults and kids were on your seats, and so far over 50,000 have been sold. They go alongside the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book by Ruth Valerio, Saying Yes to Life. SPCK, £9.99, NB Fringe event, 7:15 this evening in room 3. In the foreword, Archbishop Justin quotes one of the Communion's primates. For you Europeans, climate change is a problem for the future. For us, it is a problem of everyday survival. That's why we need to ensure that our actions and our plans are in alignment with the resolutions from the Anglican Consultative Council. We know that the environment will be a pillar of the Lambeth Conference. A lot of work's going into that. Later, the season of creation runs from the World Day of Prayer on the 1st of September to St. Francis Day on the 4th of October. A coalition of Christian environment and development charities, mission organisations and denominations are calling on churches to hold a Climate Sunday, preferably on the 6th of September, to ask congregations to make a short and simple commitment to greater action to address climate change in their own place of worship and community, and to raise their voice to urge faster action by governments. I really hope we will support that call and be part of it. Anglicans in the 1980s developed the 5 marks of mission, the 5th of which is to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and to sustain and renew the life of the earth. A crisis is both a judgment and an opportunity. In recognizing there is now a climate emergency, we need to pick up the pace by setting a target date for net zero of by 2045. Some of what's already been done is deeply impressive. The national investing bodies are not included in the scope of this motion, but their work on investments is world-class. We are widely seen to be leading the field of responsible investment. This is a work in progress with separate regular reports to Synod. There are many good environmental initiatives. Living churchyards and caring for God's acres are great ways of treasuring biodiversity that speak of the resurrection in churchyards. In schools, children and young people have become our teachers, but we don't know how many eco-schools there are or how they're reducing their carbon footprint. Eco-church and eco-diocese has engaged over 1,500 churches across the country. Many of them are Anglican. And where that's happening, churches are engaging in a wider community in education, evangelism and mission. But it's not quite 50% of dioceses, and it's less than 10% of our 16,000 churches that have engaged with eco-church. Synod, if we're serious about holding others to account, we've got to get our own house in order. If we were a company in which we invested, those making the investment would have serious questions about whether and how the Church of England is aligning itself with the Paris Agreement, let alone hoping to move faster. The deadline of 2045 to achieve net zero in 5 years is 5 years ahead of our previous target and the Paris Agreement. Some think it's not ambitious enough, and we can and must move faster. I'm happy to have that debate. What would be great if those who think they can demonstrate they can move faster will lead the way. Taking the whole church estate of 16,000 churches and approximately 29,000 other buildings is going to be very challenging indeed. The technology is changing and it may become possible to move faster, so we're proposing progress reports to Synod every 3 years, starting in 2022. That which cannot be measured cannot be managed. We've set carbon reduction targets before, and we have had a very limited ability to measure our carbon footprint. We now have for churches a simple energy footprint tool as part of the annual parish returns. It's a start, and similar will be needed for our other buildings. The aim is not to use our buildings less, but to heat them different and use them better. This motion calls on all parts of the Church of England to work to achieve reductions in carbon emissions to reach net zero by 2045. If we're to do this, we will need to front-load the change, as illustrated on page 6 of the briefing paper. As we heard in questions on Monday, we're very dependent on the work of diocesan environmental officers. Of the 35, only 4 are paid to be just DEO. 15 do their work as part of another role. 16 are unpaid. DEOs do a lot, but they can't do it all. We're asking every diocesan synod to address progress towards net zero emissions every 3 years. In our context, it is an evangelical and missionary imperative. If we don't do the 5th mark of mission, frankly, the other 4 are meaningless. Synod, this motion's serious. It's been prepared by your environmental working group. It will help us pick up the purpose and pace of what we're about in caring for God's creation. I commend it to you for debate and for support and action. What do I do? I'm proposing the motion.
You move it.
I'm moving it. I'm moving the motion.
Thank you, Bishop Nick. Item 10 is now open for debate, and I remind you that I'm imposing a speech limit of 3 minutes from the outset. May I warmly encourage members to be as concise as possible so we hear as great a variety of voices as possible. I call the Bishop of Norwich for a maiden speech, followed by Bill Seddon.
Graham Usher, Norwich 29. Thank you for calling me. As an ecologist, it feels right that the first time that I speak at General Synod is about environmental matters. I believe that seeking to heal our broken planet and tread more gently on it goes to the very core of Christian discipleship. This debate is not a luxury in the ministry of the Church, it's an imperative for the mission of the Church. One of my distinguished predecessors at Norwich was the polar explorer and glaciologist Bishop Lancelot Fleming, who steered the Antarctic Treaty Act through Parliament 60 years ago this year. Air bubbles trapped in polar ice sheets give us insights into the past. These tiny time capsules let us measure the composition of atmospheric gases from 750,000 years ago until the present day. The evidence is startling. In 1850, the level of CO2 was 280 parts per million, as it had been for the previous 10,000 years. Civilization developed in this steady climate. Yet since 1850, that has risen to 400 parts per million. The last time that the world experienced this level of CO2 in the atmosphere was 5 million years ago, when temperatures were 4 degrees warmer than today and sea levels 20 meters higher. This is the future that awaits us. And we also face a crisis of biodiversity. We only need to think about how often we clean our car windscreens compared to 25 years ago to realize the catastrophic loss of insect life. But I do worry about a narrative of gloom. In some places, it's leading to inertia. What can I do, we ask? And worryingly, many young people are being consumed by ecological anxiety. Can we also say, alongside the lament and the protest, something from deep within our scriptures about a hope-filled ecology of wonder and gratitude? Might we wonder at the beauty of God's creation and be motivated to protect it? Might we respond well by being overcome with gratitude to God for the rich diversity of creation and so treasure it? This is why I'm giving every confirmation candidate a hazel tree to plant, so that they, like Mother Julian, will one day hold in the palm of their hand a hazelnut and wonder and give thanks. And why we must learn from our sisters and brothers in Christ around the Anglican Communion. The Anglicans of South Africa, for example, go out at the end of the season of creation with words of hope and rejoicing all around them. So, Synod, I urge you to support this motion so that in 16,000 local places, we may kindle a care of creation at the heart of our discipleship. Thank you.
I call Bill Seddon, followed by Prudence Daly.
Bill Seddon, St Albans 395. Chair, thank you for calling me. I would like to urge Synod to vote for the motion as it is. It calls on us to prioritise the fifth mark of mission, which I repeat again, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. And to recognise that unless we do this, our pursuit of the other 4 marks, as the Bishop of Salisbury has already reminded us, will lack credibility. In this context, I believe that the suggested new target of net zero carbon emissions by 2045 is an appropriate mix of the prophetic and the achievable. I was pleased to note that GS 2159 put the emphasis on how we as individuals should be seeking to make environmental stewardship part of our personal witness. In the past, we may have fought shy of making what could be costly changes to our individual lifestyles, relying instead on calls for the national investment bodies to take the strain by, for example, disinvestment from fossil fuel companies. As one of the Synod elected members of the Pensions Board, I've been privileged to see the huge efforts taken by the board to make the transition to a low-carbon economy an integral part of its investment philosophy. I've also witnessed the immense strides taken by all 3 NIBs over many years when working with them through my previous role in investment with the Methodist Church. Please don't be distracted by the exclusion of the NIBs from the new target. They are amongst the leading investors on climate change issues, as seen by the remarkable Transition Pathways Initiative and their Climate Action 100 work, to name but 2 of the many examples that could be given. I would conclude by a plea for a symbolic action that parishes and their congregations be encouraged to take. All will know that Methodists don't go in for alcohol, and that's because it's not allowed on their premises at a cost to anybody who goes to an event there. Could thought be given to some action that becomes synonymous with the Church of England's commitment to minimise climate change? Perhaps all parishes could be encouraged to become eco-churches, not just the 10% as at the moment, so that we can seek improvements year by year. And at the same time, perhaps suggest to our congregations to use carbon footprint apps to achieve reductions in our own household emissions. If people are to believe what we say on climate change, they need to see evidence that it makes a difference to how we act, not only as an institution, but also as individuals. Thank you.
I call Prudence Daly and the Prosecutor of the Northern Province.
Prudence Daly, 376 Oxford. Well, I think some of you probably know what I'm going to say. If the entire objectives of the Paris Climate Agreement were achieved, there would be a reduction in global temperatures of 0.3 degrees by the end of the century. That's by 2100. Climate emissions from Western countries are dwarfed by those from India, China, and from third world countries developing rapidly in parallel with massive reductions in global poverty, which surely we must all celebrate, but which go hand in hand with generating a lot of CO2 as those countries industrialize. These kind of measures are like taking water out of the ocean with a pipette. And at the same time, they cost money. They cost money which parishes need for mission. Now, it would be worth it if it was going to avert a catastrophe. The IPCC estimates that if things carry on as they are, if nothing changes, the impact by 2070 will be the equivalent to a loss in average global income of up to 2%. That's about the same as the impact of a global recession. That's in a world where everybody will be very much better off than they are today. It doesn't really sound like an emergency, but it's still a problem. It's a problem that needs to be solved. But there's only one realistic way to fix it, and that's not by asking everybody to use less and more expensive energy. That isn't going to work. The only realistic way to fix this problem is through scientific innovation that lowers the price of clean energy below that of fossil fuels. And I have confidence that scientific ingenuity will enable that to happen, and I think we should all be encouraging that to happen. But please, don't think that aiming for zero emissions in our churches is going to make any difference at all, because I'm afraid it won't. Thank you.
Chris Newlands, followed by the Second Church Estates Commissioner for a maiden speech. And then after that, I'm going to call upon Andrew Nunn to move, to speak to his amendments. Thank you.
Burn 70, Chair, thank you for calling me. To be able to speak on this most vital of subjects and to be heard by many beyond the walls of this chamber is a tremendous privilege and responsibility for all of us. There is, we all know, a huge groundswell of support for our commitment to addressing the climate emergency. But in the detail of the discussion, we have to balance the urgency of the issues before us with the achievability of the change that we all know is needed. And we need to bring everyone with us across all parts of the church. This includes church buildings, of course, and especially the largest of our buildings, our cathedrals and major churches, but also schools, clergy housing, and the NCIs. Net zero emissions by 2045 at the latest is an ambitious but achievable target. However, what is really needed is that we all begin now to work as hard as we can to reduce our emissions year on year, and be clear that the target date is less important than the direction of travel that we all work towards to achieve net zero. The way we run our buildings is, of course, missional, in that it reflects our commitment to the fifth mark of mission, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and to sustain and renew the life of the earth, as Bishop Nicholas has reminded us in his presentation to this debate. As a member of the Church Buildings Council, I'm delighted that our body has recently discussed and agreed heating principles which will help guide churches towards more efficient lighting and heating. This is why it will be so important to include DACs and advisors in the shared task of reducing our emissions in our 16,000 churches, 4,700 schools, as well as clergy houses and diocesan offices, away from gas and oil to electric heating provided by green electricity, and focusing more on heating people than heating spaces. There is already far too much hot air of the wrong kind in our buildings. Let's have instead people who are on fire with a passion for preaching a gospel which proclaims God's love for all his creation in all its glorious abundance. Thank you.
The Second Church Estates Commissioner, and then I will be inviting Andrew Nunn to speak to his amendments.
Andrew Selous, 458, Second Church Estates Commissioner. Thank you, Chair, for calling me to make my maiden speech to Synod. It's a very great privilege to be able to do so as the new Second Church Estates Commissioner, and I'd like to pay tribute to my predecessor and good friend, Caroline Spellman, for everything she did in this role. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to speak in this important debate, having been a Green Conservative since before David Cameron made it fashionable. Overall progress on emissions reductions doesn't always stand out from tallies of individual voting records. And with December's general election fresh in my mind, I know how important this issue is to people up and down the country and to very many Christians in particular. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, reads the opening verse of the Bible. We have a special duty to care for the creation of our Creator. And I recognise that people are dying today because of the impact of changing climate on agriculture and the movement of people and the conflict that is often caused as a result. Those who led the world into the Industrial Revolution have a duty now to lead it towards a greener future and provide practical support to developing countries towards this goal. And the power of the church leading by example should not be underestimated. Getting our own house in order gives us an increased moral authority to approach the Houses of Parliament on this issue. And I look forward to the churches providing Parliament and government with the evidence every 3 years that this is happening. I want the church to speak loudly and clearly across the country, and the Anglican Communion to do the same across the world in the run-up to the Convention on Biological Diversity in China in October and to COP26 in Glasgow in November. Now, I'm delighted that the Church Commissioners have joined the Net Zero Asset Alliance last month, making a commitment to transition our investments to net zero emissions by 2050 and hopefully sooner. The FTSE Transway Pathway Emission Climate Index developed by the Church is a global first. There is, of course, more for the Commissioners to do, as there is with our physical estate, where we clearly still have work to do, with 93% of our churches not yet registered as eco-churches. Now, I recognise the challenges for many churches in reducing their emissions. This work will not be easy, but I am encouraged by the many examples of good practice already happening. Well done to Exeter for providing a discount on electric vehicles for clergy, staff and readers. It's good to see Leicester putting a solar farm on Glebe passengers and many other similar examples. And yes, I absolutely recognise the central role of government in helping us to achieve these objectives, and I will play my part in helping the government to get to the right place in these issues. Even though the UK has cut carbon emissions faster than any similar developed country, the government recognises there's more to do and will lead the fight against climate change by delivering on our net zero target by 2050. At COP26, we'll ask our global partners to match our ambition. The sale of new conventional and diesel cars will end in 2035. We will have 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030.
I now invite Andrew to speak to amendments 49 and 53, and then to move item 49. You have up to 3 minutes, Andrew.
Thank you. Andrew Nunn, Dean's 55. Thank you for this motion and this debate. When I looked at it, though, I thought cathedrals should be there named, particularly after the cathedrals measure that we were looking at yesterday, and the responsibility that we have within the diocese to be a focus for mission and for the life of the diocese. So I think it's good that we set the challenge for cathedrals there explicitly rather than implicitly, as it would have been before, and to lay upon cathedral chapters the responsibility of reporting back. Now, it will be a challenge for us, as this is a challenge for every church. These are big buildings, complex buildings, historic buildings. They are set often, not all, but most set within lovely closes. There's a lot to do, there's a lot to address. Every morning, as you probably know, I open my curtains, look out my window, across the river, at the gorgeousness of St. Paul's Cathedral, and thank God I'm not the Dean. And I'm just looking forward to the chapter of St. Paul's, beginning to embrace the possibility of solar panels on that dome. And we ourselves at Southwark, with a great south-facing roof, but so obvious by the railway line that at the moment, FACs and CFCE might have problems with us putting solar panels all the way along that. We need to ask these questions and address these issues, and I think that the amendments that I've put forward of actually making explicit the role of cathedrals in this and the role of the cathedral chapter will really hold us to that task. I therefore move Amendment 49 in my name.
Thank you, Andrew. I now invite the Bishop of Salisbury to respond. Bishop, you have up to 3 minutes. If it can be less, that would be marvellous.
I was wondering about how to handle all the amendments. What I don't want to do is to get down in the weeds and prevent the main conversation taking place. I want to keep fairly high level. And the motion does call for all parts of the Church of England and doesn't name cathedrals. Andrew's right. So I'm very happy to accept this amendment because it will allow us to deal with it quickly. But I just want to say that I think the amendments are a really helpful way of framing the debate, of getting into the discussion, but let's try to keep the conversation sort of focused on the target and the main purpose of what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to accept these amendments, and I hope we can move on relatively quickly.
The debate is now open on item 49. You've heard the encouragement of the Bishop of Salisbury to keep to the main theme, but speeches on this will be limited to 2 minutes. I call Bill Bravener.
Bill Bravener, Durham 104. Thank you, Chair, for calling me. Synod, the issue before us is mission. It's the 5th mark of mission, but it's all the marks of mission. And if we think we're not talking about mission, then we're making the wrong call and we're missing out on God's leading. We need to be able to say that the church is leading the way on this issue. And it'd be wonderful when we can say that fully and across the board. People need time to effect change, of course they do. There are capital projects that need to be done. There's deep cultural change that needs to happen in the way we live together. But Synod, we don't have much time to play with. And this issue grows more urgent every day. The timetable to 2045 is achievable with effort and encouragement and support across all of our buildings, churches, schools, vicarages, offices, etc. Those who can go faster should go faster. And there may be those who can be pushed to achieve 2030, and that must be encouraged for those for whom it's possible. But the variety of our buildings has to be taken into account, the context has to be taken into account, what's possible in other places needs to be taken into account.
Mr. Bravener, are you speaking to item 49?
Sorry,
which is on the amendment on cathedrals?
Yes, what I want to say is that the whole church needs to do this. Cathedrals have to be included, as well as everybody else, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. But the main point I wanted to make about that was that we need to be able to encourage all parts of our church, cathedrals, schools, everybody else. We need some resource to be put into this. And it's great if we spend lots and lots of money on building resourcing churches and growing big churches in other places, but if they're all underwater, then it's not going to be very helpful. So I want to ask, can across the church we put resource into this and put our money where our mouth is and develop exemplar cathedrals, buildings, schools, vicarages in the regions that people can look to for inspiration and for guidance? Thank you.
I see no one standing, so I now put item 49 to the vote. Will all those in favour please show? All those against? Thank you. The motion is now amended by item 49. I now invite John Spence, Canon Spence, to speak to and to move item 50 and to draw your attention to the fact that for item 50 there is a financial statement on your 13th notice paper. Thank you, Canon Spence.
John Spence, Archbishop's Council 467, and a man with a confession to make. When I first read this motion, my sentiments were negative, almost hostile. How can we do this, I said, when we are already coping with parishes under severe financial pressure, where dioceses are reducing their numbers of stipendiary priests, where our carbon footprint is being reduced not for good reasons, but because churches are closing and activities are ceasing. But then two things happened. Firstly, I read the associated papers and came to understand that even with all the excellent work going on now, we will not achieve the existing target of 2050, let alone a more adventurous one. And secondly, I realized that I had been thinking this as a zero-sum game, where actually it cannot be either or, it has to be both and. What is the point of proclaiming the glorious gospel of the risen Christ if we are not at the same time in the vanguard of expressing the joys and hope of his creation and preserving it, of God's creation and preserving it? What is the point of reaching out to younger people if we are not equally embracing the issue which is closest to their hearts? What is the point of our national investing bodies having groundbreaking world-class activities if we're not putting our own house in order? And what, I may say, is the point of the government listing thousands of our buildings for conservation status without them then helping us conserve them in environmentally friendly ways? So the purpose of this amendment is twofold, and I hope it will be acceptable to the Bishop. Firstly, to stress the urgency and universality of responsibility. This is not an issue to be delegated to the Church at the centre. It is dependent on our individual and collective behaviours at home, in church and in our community. But secondly, to recognise that we do need to underpin it with some central resource or some resource available to the Church, giving the necessary capacity, competence and expertise so that we can move from that or this to both and and. If this motion is passed and hopefully this amendment, I commit to Synod that I will work with the Bishop and the Environmenting Working Group to take to the next meetings of the Strategy Investment Board and the Triennial Funding Working Group papers which seek to discuss how we can create that capacity, that competence and that expertise. I don't know what it looks like yet. It may involve bringing in outside people. It may involve better funding for environmental officers at diocesan level. It may involve various things. I am clear it has to do several things. Firstly, to establish on an evidence-based basis what we are doing, what the gaps are, what needs to be done. Secondly, to provide a source of information, guidance and advice at parish and other community and church body level. Thirdly, to identify those limited number of interventions which might best be done across the church to achieve the greatest efficiency, the greatest effectiveness. Fourthly, to assess how a proper programme of activity can be created which truly will enable these targets to be achieved and might enable them to be accelerated. But let's be clear, a planned programme which achieves 80% carbon footprint reduction in the first decade and then takes a bit of time to do the other 20% is far better than one where it is 20% first and 80% at the end. And fifthly, to engage with the national investing bodies, other parts of the church and beyond, to ensure that we have the right amount of finance to create a prioritised programme of action, to have that in place, to monitor it, and to ensure it is delivered. On the basis of my commitments to Synod, I hope you will support this amendment. It is a time to move from ambition to action, from aspiration to achievement. I move the amendment that stands in my name.
Thank you, John. Call on Bishop Nick to respond. You have up to 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. John, it's always very moving to hear an Emmaus Road experience, and I'm glad that you've engaged with this in a way that's clearly moved you and has engaged you in some different ways. And I'm not having difficulty accepting this amendment. It seems to me it's really helpful. One of the things that's bothered me a lot in the time I've been the lead bishop is the way in which the pressure of the crisis that we face, it makes it quite easy for tactics to divide people about the goals that we're trying to achieve. And it's really important that we work together, all parts of the church working together. The Environmental Working Group's been focused, particularly since we were set up, on developing activity possibilities for the local church. I had assumed that what we need out of this motion is 16,000 action plans in order to address the issues of climate change. John, I think you're absolutely right. We also need a national plan to provide the framework for that. And I'm very grateful for the amendment and think that it will give us considerable capacity to move in the direction of travel with which we are all agreed.
Item 50 is now open to debate. There is a speech limit of 2 minutes. I call the Bishop of Manchester and Pete Spears.
David Walker, Bishop of Manchester, number 27, Chair for the time being of the Ethical Investment Advisory Group and Deputy Chair of the Church Commissioners. I want to support Canon Spencer's amendment. Some Synod members have already very kindly commented on the thought for the day. I did on Radio 4 earlier this morning, talking about this debate, the key point I was trying to make was that it's all very good to do progress reports, looking back at what we've done in the past, but actually we need interim targets taking us forward each year or each 3 years into the future. And that's what Canon Spencer's amendment, I believe, gives us. Through the Ethical Investment Advisory Group and now through the engagement work of the national investment bodies, including the commissioners and the pensions board, we're able to produce the Transition Pathway Initiative, where we're part of a massive coalition, many thousands of times larger than ourselves, where we're really seeing what companies are up to, how they are making promises for the future to get themselves in alignment with the Paris Agreement, step by step, not just some long-term aspiration that by 2050 we will reach some particular final destination point. And we're also challenging those companies where we don't think they've got the right governance or management structures in place. And I think, again, that what Canon Spence is offering us in this amendment will help us to make sure we got the right structures to govern and to manage our work year by year, not just to 2045 or whatever year we end up with, but year by year, not just aspirations, not just progress reports from the past, but what we're going to do next year, this year. So I support this amendment and urge Synod to do the same.
I call Pete Spears, and then after Pete has spoken, I'm going to test the mind of Synod on a motion for closure on this amendment debate.
Thank you for calling me. Pete Spears, Liverpool 156. I support this amendment, and I have a suggestion as well for Canon Spence, because in this debate there'll be a lot of talk perhaps about the resources and where we were going to get the money to pay for it. Well, I know where we could get the money from. The £1.4 billion of money in historic endowments in the diocese. And Prudence is from a diocese that she knows very well, and they have £200 million as of 2017, certainly. And it's not evenly spread. The top 5 dioceses have about a third of those resources. So I wonder whether a tiny contribution from some of those dioceses towards the resourcing of this debate and this action could go a long way. After all, we are all in this together. One of my jobs as an archdeacon is to go to PCCs who are unable to afford the parish share, and they will tell me, but Archdeacon, we haven't got any money. And what they mean is that they haven't got any money in their current account, but often have them in unrestricted reserves. And so I point this out. And I also say, what's that money there for? They say, oh, that's for the rainy day. And I say to them, today is the rainy day. So please support this amendment and do not be put off by the resources that no doubt the Central Church will feel under pressure to contribute to. You can go back to your diocese and suggest to your DBF trustees that perhaps they might be able to release a little bit of those, especially those dioceses that have more than others. Thank you.
I see no one standing, so I'm now going to call for a vote on item 50. All those in favour, please show. All those against, please show. Item 50 is clearly carried and the motion so amended. I now call both Martin Gainsborough and Sue Boys to speak to, but not to move their amendments, 51 and 52, at this point. I want to hear Sue Boys speak to her amendment, but do note that if item 51 is passed, item 52 will lapse. Martin Gainsborough, you have up to 3 minutes.
Martin Gainsborough, Bristol 71. Thank you, Chair. Thank you all to everyone who's spoken so far, but I want to push us a little bit harder whilst not underestimating the challenge that we face. I want to persuade you that 2030 net zero, the target Bristol Diocese has committed itself to, not 2045, is the right target for all of us. And by right, I mean right scientifically, theologically, and ethically, and that it's achievable if we're determined enough. So why 2030? First, scientifically, the seriousness of the situation we're facing as a planet cannot be overstated. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we have less than 11 years, not 25 years, 11 years, to drastically reduce our emissions, or we will not avoid catastrophic climate change. Next, we should commit to 2030 because it's the right thing to do ethically. We all know that climate change disproportionately affects the poorest, in low-lying islands like Fiji, in Bangladesh, in South Africa. To not move quickly is to condemn our brothers and sisters to an uncertain future. I, for one, cannot look them in the eye and say, I didn't care enough not to change rapidly how I live. And there are unassailable theological reasons why we must commit to net zero by 2030. The Christian faith is about sacrificial love. Faith is risky. A 2030 target says we believe in a God that goes before us, bringing new life and transformation. I've had the privilege over the last few years of leading Bristol Diocese's work on the climate crisis. In November, we passed our new environment and climate justice policy and committed to net zero by 2030. Joining 60 councils in the UK have also committed to 2030. Of course, we're not oblivious to the challenges, but we can see the path to net zero in the next decade. Focusing on our diocesan offices and clergy houses, working with churches and schools, we are decarbonising energy production using proven methods, reducing energy efficiency and looking at our indirect emissions as well. There are challenges, but let's not exaggerate them. Before I finish, I'd like also to speak from the heart. Synod, I am flabbergasted that anyone can think that a 2045 target is acceptable. It's not acceptable. As the world overheats and ecosystems are destroyed, are we really saying that we're unwilling to set an ambitious target for fear of failing? We must aim high and step up. Synod, at a time when our public standing is not at its highest, let's really lead for once, and let's commit, all of us, to moving heaven and earth to make this happen. There's nothing more important than this. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I'll now invite Sue Boys to speak to item 52.
Boys, Oxford 186.
Sorry, you have up to 3 minutes.
Friends, I wonder how you manage your deadlines. Sometimes I set a deadline a long time ahead so that I'm certain I can manage it, and others I set one close to my nose, and I know when I do that I'm taking a risk. I welcome the good sense of this motion, the passion that I feel in this chamber, and I share Dr. Gainsborough's sense of urgency. In Oxford Diocese, we are from the bottom up deeply concerned about the climate emergency, with 3 deanery synod motions coming to diocesan synod in a couple of weeks' time. We believe our new diocesan environmental task group can help lead the way in responding to paragraph C of this excellent motion. The group draws members from within diocese, business and academy to look at the whole picture, integrating theology and communications, policy and advocacy, individual, church and community engagement. We are taking seriously planning for net zero and integrating the 5th mark of mission across all aspects of our planning. Our task group is working on a 10-year strategy with 2-year action plans, a long view marked out by flexibility and the freedom to work with changing deadlines. 2 things are being underlined for us in beginning this work. First, that it is a big challenge, and second, that in this constantly changing landscape, a long-term fixed plan risks locking us in. We all want to achieve carbon neutral quickly and realistically, And this amendment offers the Synod an opportunity assessment of this changing situation every 3 years alongside the proposed progress reports, offering freedom and flexibility to move in a timely way, as I understand within the cost of the amendment already accepted. My amendment comes firmly alongside the principles of the main motion and offers additional provision, allowing us to maintain a sense of urgency and manage our deadlines well.
Martin, I now invite you to formally move item 51.
I beg to move the amendment standing in my name.
Thank you. Bishop Nick, you are invited now to respond. You have up to 3 minutes.
As the Bishop of Manchester said on Thought for the Day this morning, actually this is the heart of the debate, isn't it? How fast can we move in what is now an agreed direction of travel? So I think we do need to spend some time on this. I'm going to resist both amendments, but I want to start by saying I'm really grateful to the Diocese of Bristol and Oxford. They are field leaders among us. They put me under a bit of pressure, to be honest, as the lead bishop on this in the Environmental Working Group. I think that's really helpful, and I very much admire the work that's going on. So thank you to Martin and Sue for the amendments. I want us to keep it simple. I think that's why one of the reasons why I'm resisting the amendments. Of course, there's a great temptation to say we've got to do it now. That's part of the pressure of Greta Thunberg or the Extinction Rebellion people and climate justice people outside. Get it done now, it's so urgent. But you know, if you've got a church boiler, a heating system that's working okay, you know that you're going to have to review it by 2045, but if you put a deadline on everybody of 2030, parishes will be committed to additional financial expense that when it's not yet necessary to review the heating system. I think that will cause some resentment in local churches. It will also increase carbon footprint for getting rid of stuff before it's out of its natural life. By having the 2045 date, we know that everybody's going to have to review their heating and lighting. The technology is changing fast. We will be able to make best use of best practice as we go along. We've built into the motion a 3-year review, coming back first in 2022. I don't think the Oxford motion will add very much more to that, but let's see what you think, because this is the heart of it, and it is about how fast can we travel. And I've got every sympathy with what Chris Newland said about the importance of us travelling together as a Church of England with the complexity of the estates that are our responsibility. It isn't a simple problem, and we are going to have to travel with others together as we do this as a church. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. Bishop Nick is resisting this amendment, so before we move to any debate, I would need to see 25 members standing. There are 25 members standing, so item 51 is now open for debate, and I remind you to look at the financial statement about this on the 13th notice paper. I call the Bishop of Liverpool. And Brian at the back, please.
Forgive me, Chair, how long
The
do I...
speech limit, sorry, is 3 minutes, but if you can be briefer, that would be wonderful.
Always, thank you. I want to support this amendment. Paul Bayes, Liverpool, number 26. I want to support this amendment. I encourage the Synod to do so too. I know it's very easy to pluck net zero dates from the air, but I do regret the timidity of the framers of the motion in reaching for the blurred phrase by 2045 at the latest. In classical Anglican fashion, I seek a middle way, but in this case, it's a middle way between the 2025 demand of Extinction Rebellion, with whose protests, incidentally, and those of Christian Climate Action, I am proud to have identified myself, between that and the aim of the present motion. Therefore, we arrive at 2030. Readers of the background paper 20 2159 will have noticed the difference in tone between the words with which Bishop Nick began. There is a crisis, his phrase, faster action, picking up the pace, and then the diplomacy, for example, paragraph 19, which talks about, quote, a balance between achievability and prophetic emphasis. I must say it's hard to see prophetic emphasis in a date which even many of the plutocrats of Davos seem to think is not too difficult to set. Prophecy is a gift of the church, rarely implemented in synods. But I hope that today we can connect with our prophetic inheritance to the modest extent of setting ourselves a target, which is indeed more difficult, but is not impossible. I respect the work of the EWG, the technical skill of its advisors. But here in this synod, we are concerned with leadership. Like the paper, I honor the aims of dioceses, Oxford, Bristol, Birmingham, and the paper clearly sees their aim as achievable. So instead of holding them up as models, I shall be glad in Liverpool, whose city council has set the 2030 target, to join them. And I can't see why this synod can't invite the whole church to do the same. In Liverpool Diocese, we've moved in less than a year from a single eco-church to a bronze award as an eco-diocese. We are in line for silver and eventually for gold, a good deal before 2030. My own home, which contains a chapel, is after 8 months a silver eco-church and will be gold before this synod meets again. I'm saying these things simply to indicate that if we can do it, anyone can do it. And surely, by mutual encouragement and discipline, we can do it together. In short, then, I strongly support Professor Gainsborough's amendment, and I exhort the Synod to do the same. Thank you.
I call Brian, and to be followed by Catherine Grills.
Brian Wilson, Southwark 416. I am against this amendment. I think that the whole idea of spending the historic reserves of the church's finances on eco-friendly actions is incorrect. If we have finances that are available, the top priority of the church is to preach the gospel to the lost. That is the business of the church, saving those who will be sent into hell if they do not hear the gospel and receive the gospel. Talk of improving heating resources is totally secondary. Please, church, can we get our priorities right? Thank you.
Sorry? Catherine Grills, followed by the Prosecutor for the Southern Province.
Catherine Grills, Birmingham 63, and a member of the Environmental Working Group. At the Christian Aid Fringe last evening, we prayed that God may bless us with wonder at creation's glory, fury at creation's spoiling, and courage at this critical hour. Absolutely. But I'd add inspiration to act wisely. Historic England have learned much about maladaptation. We want to avoid negative, unintended consequences of our actions in ancient and newer buildings. The best action is not always clear, at least at present. We will have to learn as we go along, together under God, our Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer of all that is. I would love to be listening to the live stream from Synod in 10 years' time with the folk of the worshipping communities where I'm then parish priest, and hear that we, the Church of England in all our many parts, have been so transformed that our carbon footprint is zero. But I just can't see the path to get us there yet. The motion with this amendment would be more than a challenge. It's in danger of being overwhelming, even paralysing. What will we do in the church on the estate where I am vicar now if the gas boiler in the hall breaks down next winter? Working on how we might use the garden for the basis of a ground source heat pump or some newer technology will take us some time, and the mechanisms to support us are not quite there yet. But if we installed a new gas boiler because the hall needs to be open for the community, we would be ripping it out before the end of its useful life to reach a 2030 target. And that's a waste. So what I would love and what I can imagine and plan for is to be listening to a report back to Synod in 2-3 years' time and hear that progress in cutting carbon emissions is falling in line with the curve on page 6 of GS 2159. That plans are starting to emerge all across the church that mean an 11% year-on-year reduction can continue. That would mean a 70% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. Let's not underestimate how much change that requires. It is ambitious. For everyone, an 11% reduction is a significant challenge. Over a millennia ago, St. Benedict in his rule called disciples of Christ to live a life that was radical and one of balance. The wisdom of the rule is clear that living well with creation is absolutely core to being a disciple of Christ. This motion and what is spelled out in more detail in GS 2159 is a call that is balanced and yet a call to radical action. I would urge you to stick with 2045 and regular reviews. Our actions as a whole church over the next 5 years could enable a new synod to bring forward the date when we aim to reach net zero. Pray God that they do. This planet and her people, created by God, redeemed by Christ, is our common home. Our sisters and brothers across the world need us to live differently now. Thank you.
Members of Synod, friends, before I invite the prosecutor to speak, I give warning, Simon, that it's going to be 2-minute speech limit now. It's really important that this debate comes to a vote on the main motion. Otherwise, we lose it, and that would be a disaster. So I'm going to test your mind whether you would agree and give consent to extending this sitting by not more than 15 minutes in order that we can hear there's a further amendment to be heard, and then it may not need 15 minutes, but yes, that's your mind. I need to test your mind. I propose an extension of sitting of not more than 15 minutes if we need it. Does the Synod give its general consent? Thank you very much. I'm afraid I'll be getting even more brutal with the speech limits, and I will endeavour to have us finished as soon as possible. Thank you very much indeed. Simon.
Simon Butler, Southwark 219. I, unlike Brian Wilson, I'm not confident about exactly who is going to hell and who isn't, but I'm certainly not prepared to be part of a country whose actions may contribute to the people of Australia living in further hell than they already have in the past year. Synod, I wasn't going to support Martin Gainsborough's amendment, and then I thought, well, hang on a minute. What's the danger of setting a target for 2030? I mean, if people don't make it, we've not lost anything, have we? I mean, other people will have been given some energy to get on with things. So let's not be afraid of setting those deadlines. In St Mary's Battersea at the moment, we're currently doing our mission action plan for the next 5 years. It's for the first time ever we have got an item on climate change and how we as a parish respond to climate change. I think there are many, many parishes that are still way behind the curve on this. And adding some energy to it by setting a nearer target won't harm our efforts, but they will engage us far more accurately. So let's support Martin.
I'm now going to test the mind of the Synod on a motion for closure on this amendment debate. Will those in favour of closure please show? And those against, please show. That's clearly carried. So I now ask Bishop Nick to respond to the debate. No, apparently not. We go straight to a vote. You sure?
Yes.
Wonderful. Right. So we now vote on item 51. Would those in favour of item 51 please show? Would those against please show? I think we're going to need a definite count. It's looking very 50-50 to me. So can I order a count of the Synod? I order a counted vote of the whole Synod. We will dispense with the bell. I'll do it now, yes? This is a counted vote of the whole Synod. Those in favour should press 1. Those against should press 2. Those who wish to record an abstention should press 3.
The voting period is now open and will end in 1 minute. The voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has now ended.
The result of the count is that those in favour numbered 144, those against 129, with 10 abstentions. So the amendment is lost. So,
Carried.
I beg your pardon, carried. The amendment is carried. Friends, item 52 now lapses as not being relevant at this point. So we now move I call Andrew Nunn. Andrew, could you please move item 53 formally? You introduced it earlier, and then I will call on the Bishop of Salisbury to reply. Thank you. Bishop Nick, I call on you to respond.
I do so accept.
Thank you. Item 53 is now open for debate. Point of order, Mr. Freeman. I will if I see anybody standing. I see no one standing, so I now put item 53 to the vote. All those in favour, please show. All those against. Item 53 is clearly carried. I now call on John Appleby to speak to and to move his amendment. John, I apologise, but the speech limit is now 2 minutes.
Thank you for calling me. I welcome the motion. I welcome the passions that have been put in and the excellent paper supporting. Before this last amendment, last but one amendment was passed, I was applauding the 70% reduction by 2030 that was implicit in that paper, which I felt was the kind of target everybody could commit to and will not overwhelm people, but there we are. We've got the amendment as it is. This morning, the Bishop of Manchester on Radio 4 said, what do we want, but not yet? I think that is the big danger. Obviously, this motion and the amendment are trying to get people to commit, but people are going to vary in their responses.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, in a different debate, pointed out that things that become normalised and we stop noticing. And although this is primarily about carbon reduction, it addresses all the issues of waste and pollution and biodiversity and all the things that we have come to sort of normalise. An article this morning in The Guardian said that on a very mundane subject, in the UK we now throw away 7 million mattresses a year, and that is a huge waste, but we've got used to comfort and convenience. The issue of individual contributions, Prudence Daly seemed to suggest that they don't matter, but in 1 Kings 19, Elijah was told by God that his individual contribution did matter and he wasn't alone. We need to also recognise our contributions are part of proving to government that it matters to us. We all need to set ourselves milestones. Even with the amended date, every parish and body needs to set its own milestones that it can achieve and not even wait a few more years. So let's do that. And lastly, I will point out that as drafting by Church House staff, not by me, the blank brackets at the beginning of my amendment, which should contain a D, are the sort of tokenistic effort to save ink that is not good enough. I move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
John, would you please formally move your amendment?
I beg to move the amendment, stand in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Bishop Nick, I call on you to respond, please. You have up to 2 minutes.
Thanks. John's a member of Mission and Public Affairs. I understand there was a discussion there. It's been discussed by the Environmental Working Group. It adds nothing to the process of what we're about, I think, given that we've got a request to all parts of the Church of England to address the issues, and everybody's going to have to work out their own milestones. I have to say, Synod, in relation to the amendment that's been passed and bringing forward to the date of 2030, the test of prophecy is whether prophecy can be made true, and you've put an enormous burden on yourselves and the wider Church in setting the targets that you have. But I will resist this amendment because I don't think it adds anything to that. I think that's the much more substantial part of this debate.
Bishop Nick has resisted this amendment, so it will fall unless I see 25 members standing. There are not, so the amendment falls. We now resume the debate on the main motion as amended, and the speech limit will now be, I am sorry and I apologise for the brutality, the speech limit will be 2 minutes. The lady at the back there with the hand up, yep. Clive, Carl, thank you. 2 minutes, please.
I've got teenagers. I think I've told Zoe Hemming, Lichfield 145. Teenagers, and they are very aware of the enormity of this. And we know that climate anxiety is a real thing. And we've been told that our small actions are like taking water from the sea with a pipette. Well, I'm delighted that we have better news than that and alternative images of that with which to travel with our teenagers. Synod, we have the most hopeful image there is of small action and massive impact. We have yeast in the dough. And so let's move forward, each and every one of us. Tiny, insignificant, brave, risky action with that kind of hope. Thank you.
Order. Thank you, but I'm now wonderfully able to introduce a motion for closure myself at the time I deem fit. But first of all, I'd like to hear Carl, please, and then is Mr. Clive Mathers standing? Would you like? I invite you to speak after Carl if you would wish to. You may. I then call Margaret Swinson, after which I will be testing the mind of Synod on closure.
Carl Hughes, Southwark 413. Madam Chairman, thank you for calling me. I wasn't intending to speak in this debate, and I fully supported the original motion. I'm standing simply to apologise to Bishop Nick and also to those members of the Diocese of Southwark to whom I had committed that I would vote for this motion. However, I find myself in the position now that, as amended, I'm afraid I, for one, cannot now support this motion. I fear that we have set a target which is totally unrealistic, is unsupported by any plans, and unfortunately, on those grounds, for me, I can no longer add my name to the yeses.
Margaret Swinson.
Margaret Swinson, Liverpool 348. As Vice Chair of the Anglican Consultative Council, I think it's really appropriate to bring our debate to a close by coming back to the resolutions that the ACC passed. They are the foundation of the motion today. They remind us that the Church of England, much though we like to think of ourselves as very important, is part and a small part of a global communion. A global communion where this is an absolute emergency, which makes the 2030 target very appropriate. That recognises also the importance of mission, the fifth mark of mission, and, as was referred to earlier, the other marks of mission. For when climate emergency strikes our fellow Anglicans and other communities around the world, we do exercise mission in delivering response to human need. It also reminds us that we should be, as we were encouraged this morning, looking at the world from the point of view of the vulnerable, from the point of view of Indigenous peoples, from the point of view of peoples for whom this emergency means they are planning to relocate their homes, not in 20 years' time, but immediately. And so I hope as we vote for this, and I hope we will vote for this, we remember that we are a part of that global communion. It is not things that are happening to them, these things are happening to us. And let's bear that in mind as we support this motion.
I'm going to call Sophie Mitchell, as I would like to hear the voice from a younger generation as we come towards the end of this debate. After Sophie's spoken, I will be testing the mind for closure.
Sophie Mitchell, CYC Rep 483. Thank you very much, Chair, for calling me. 2019 was the year of climate action and climate emergency declarations. It was the year that Greta Thunberg stood before the UN Climate Action Summit and said, "For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are nowhere in sight." It was also the year that thousands of ordinary people, many of which were young people, took to the streets and participated in climate actions like the ones stood outside Church House today. Over the last year, we've begun to wake up to the increasing threat of the climate emergency, but at great cost to our planet. We've all seen the news stories of floods in Indonesia and bushfires in Australia. Synod, we know what we need to do. We must act big and act fast. During the environment debate in Feb 2019, I used my maiden speech to say that what is required is not more documentation, but clear plans, clear actions, and clear deadlines. I was pleased at the time that Synod was recognising the increasing threat of the climate crisis, but felt cautious that it wouldn't lead to any real change. So I now must thank you and thank the Synod Environmental Group for this motion. This motion is strong because it sets clear targets and it creates an accountability for our targets. It's exactly what I asked for last year in the debate. I'd like to draw your attention to the final paragraph of GS 2159, which states that many of us won't be around to hear the Synod report that we've hit our zero emissions target. Though I did enjoy the humour in this statement, I'd like to remind you of its serious connotations. I plan on being here, but I know that many of you won't be. In my February speech, I urged you to think about your children and grandchildren, for they will be left to face the consequences of your decisions on climate change. So please vote in favour of this motion, but also be prepared to act big and act fast. Thank you.
I now wish to test the mind of Synod on a motion for closure. Those in favour of closure, please show. And those against? That's clearly carried. So I now invite the Bishop of Salisbury to respond to this debate. Bishop, you have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. That's been a very engaging, interesting, and distinctly challenging debate. I thought there was there's some real clarity, I think, in what Synod's been talking about. Certainly, some of the speeches have emphasised the importance of spirituality, about the theology of creation, about what we believe and think affecting what we do. I thought that there were some powerful comments about the connection between church and state. I was very grateful for those making maiden speeches. Bishop of Norwich, Chris Newlands, the Second Church of States Commissioner, said, didn't he, that church has got to exercise leadership and we've got to put our own house in order before we are credible in doing that. I think that's where my caution came in. In the introduction to the debate, I pointed out that fewer than 10% of Church of England churches have engaged with eco-church. I'm pleased that the Bishop of Liverpool is so confident that he will take his churches from one in the diocese to an eco-diocese with a gold award, Paul, not just before 2030. It's got to be faster than that. We're proposing to be at absolute zero now by 2030. You're talking about doing this in a matter of years. So that's what we've got to do. We've got to introduce a staged process to achieve this with realistic marking points, which are no longer that 70% reduction by 2030, as in the paper supporting the original motion, but are now saying this is a game changer, folks, and I don't know how we're going to do it. But we've said we'll do it, and those who've set that target have said, well, it's a target, so let's see what happens if we do it. So that's what we've agreed. We'll come back in 2022, as indicated, with 3-year reviews, and we'll try to achieve the maximum that's possible. I'd have to say, I think it's a very tall order that you have set yourselves. There was a question about buildings, which was actually raised by Andrew Nunn in relation to cathedrals. And there is that question about how do we handle having heritage buildings, of which we have so many, and the environmental best practice that we know is coming upon us. And there's a real difficulty, which Catherine Grills spoke about, in relation to the dangers of maladaptation of buildings. You have to do what's best now, and it takes some time to work out. It isn't as simple as one thing trumping another. It's about how we hold those two aspects of heritage buildings and environmental best practice together. We're learning to do it, and there are some brilliant examples of best practice. For example, Gloucester Cathedral solar panels, Manchester Cathedral's ground source heating, and so on. St George's Wash Common in Newbury is carbon neutral. How do the rest of us learn to do it? Some things are simple and can be done with existing technology. That's why we were setting the 70% reduction by 2030. Some things are going to be much more challenging and will actually, it's interesting enough, as Prudence Daly pointed out, are going to depend on science helping to provide new technology. It's changing fast. Christiane Figueres, who chaired the climate change talks in Paris, said that 10 years ago, we would not have believed we could have made such progress. Well, Synod, I hope that that will be true when we meet, or our successors meet, in 2030. But I'd have to say, you're going to have to work really hard at this, convincing all the parts of the Church of England to act on this motion and to engage in a way that so far we have not yet seen. Synod, I commend the motion to you and propose it in its amended form. Thank you.
Friends, I now put the main motion as amended to the vote. Will all those in favour please show? And those against, please show. The motion as amended is clearly carried. Thank you very much, members of the Synod, for a good debate, and thank you for your forbearance. We now move to lunch break.